Добрый, добрый день, уважаемые коллеги. В рамках апрельской конференции мы сегодня проводим круглый стол, где заслушаем гостевой доклад ведущего экономиста глобальной практики по бедности Всемирного банка профессора Сэмюэля Фрейхе-Родригеса. Доклад называется «Показатели бедности, неравенства и общего процветания в странах региона Европы и Центральной Азии». Наш круглый стол организован Центром междисциплинарных исследований человеческого потенциала в сотрудничестве, в содружестве с Международной ассоциацией исследований доходов и благосостояния ЯРИФ. Профессор Фрейхе-Родригес известный специалист, который работал и в университетской среде, и вот в последнее время работает в Всемирном банке, предметно занимается исследованием бедности. И тот доклад, который он подготовил, в основе его лежит доклад Всемирного банка за 2020 год. Доклады, которые уже несколько лет, раз в 2 года Всемирный банк готовит, и посвящены они проблемам бедности. Вообще бедность категория очень сложная. Сегодня вы увидите, что для этих целей Всемирный банк использует несколько метрик. Можем сегодня поговорить, поспорить, насколько они подходят нашей стране. Можно ли использовать какие-то альтернативные вещи, потому что, конечно, бедность архисложный феномен. И с одной стороны, мы должны обеспечить наших национальных пользователей информацией о бедности, чтобы наш национальный мониторинг позволял выстраивать национальную политику по искоренению нищеты, сокращению чрезмерного неравенства и давал возможность нашим полисемейкерам отслеживать результативность этих мер. С другой стороны, конечно, мы не имеем права забывать о том, что эти оценки должны обеспечивать и международную сопоставимость, потому что, конечно, любая страна, сравнивая себя, что происходит у нее, сравнивая ситуацию в других странах, смотрит, в каких странах меры по сокращению бедности более эффективны, приносят лучший результат. Очень важно, что этот доклад включает и такое современное явление, как влияние ковид на бедность. Вы тоже сегодня это услышите и посмотрите, и мы сможем это все обсудить. Для доклада предусмотрено 30 минут. И давайте договоримся о распорядке. Все желающие, которые хотят задать вопрос, они должны записаться в чате. Или я знаю, что большая довольно аудитория присоединилась к нам в Ютубе, поэтому здесь тоже пишите. И после выступления уважаемого профессора будет возможность ответить ему на 5 вопросов первых, да, скажем так. Потом я передам слово нашему замечательному российскому исследователю Неворожкиной Людмиле Ивановне, заведующей кафедрой Ростовского экономического государственного университета, которая специализируется на измерении бедности и неравенства. И она сделает свое сообщение, расскажет, вы услышите ее сами, да. После этого будут ответы на оставшиеся вопросы. И я надеюсь, у нас останется немного времени, чтобы можно было кому-то выступить с комментариями, высказать свое мнение. Поэтому записывайтесь в чате, если, скажем так, кто-то хочет еще задать вопрос или, так сказать, выступить с комментариями уже после. Пожалуйста, вот есть рука, да, там нажимайте, просите слово. Наверное, все, что я хотел сказать. Поэтому, уважаемый Сэмюэль, прошу вас, пожалуйста. Вы готовы? Welcome.
Yes, I'm ready. Thank you very much, Professor Surinov. Добрый день. I'll now try to share the presentation. Please let me know if you can see the slides.
Yes, it's okay.
Very good. thank you very much again to the HAC Economic University for their very kind invitation. This is, as it was said at the beginning, a presentation on poverty, inequality, and shared prosperity indicators for Eastern Europe and Central Asia region. I will go through several stages. First, introduction, indicating the sources of this research, and then two sections to elaborate and explain how the World Bank is now producing multiple measures of poverty and inclusive growth as measured by what we call shared prosperity. Then I want to make a historical review of the evolution of poverty numbers under several definitions for the Eastern Europe and Central Asia region, some estimates of the impact of the pandemic on poverty for years 2020 and 2021. And then I will close with some perspectives, short-term perspectives of poverty rates for the region and some policy considerations for coming years because of the crisis of the pandemic. The World Bank is now producing every second year a global report on poverty, focusing exclusively on poverty. This is the one I'm going to use figures from, is the 2020 Reversals of Fortune, and is the third in a series of publications produced every second year. It also builds on much more substantive and complex analytical studies on poverty and development produced in 1990 and 2000, the World Development Reports on Poverty. But it's also part of a much more regular and timely assessment of monitoring poverty in the world. Now the bank produces poverty briefs every year, twice a year, for every single country, what we call poverty briefs. Let me now go to explain the 5 measures of poverty that the bank produces on a regular basis. Originally, the bank concentrated on what was called the $1-a-day poverty line, which was introduced in 1990 by that World Development Report that I mentioned, and is part of the central corporate goal of the World Bank, and also the Sustainable Development Goal of eradicating poverty by 2030. However, updates of this $1-a-day line by inflation and exchange rates is what we now call the international poverty line of $1.9 days threshold. However, there is the question of whether this is really enough to live free of poverty. The poverty line, the $1 and now $1.90 poverty line, was the collection of poverty lines from the 15 poorest countries in the world. And that has been updated by inflation and changes in exchange rates, as I indicated. But many of the researchers, academic researchers working on poverty and welfare, have indicated that the necessities of life are not fixed. They are continuously being adapted and augmented by changes that take place in societies and their development. Indicated by Townsend in 1979, and also many others like Amartya Sen and Anthony Atkinson famous researchers on poverty and standards of living, that poverty lines somehow change with development. That has led the bank to consider different poverty lines for different groups of countries. That's why we have now the low-income countries poverty line of $1.90, and for lower middle income, upper middle income countries, the poverty lines of $3.2 and $5.5 a day. These are the median of the poverty lines of a country, of a set of 126 countries that are defined as lower middle income country or upper middle income countries. And these estimates were produced around 2015 with exchange rates in purchasing power parities of year 2011. We chose the median of those poverty lines. And these are poverty lines that we are now applying to groups of countries. So the 190 will apply to countries with less than $1,000 per capita. The lower middle income countries, for countries between $1,000 and $4,000 per capita per year. And the upper middle income countries, or the upper middle income line for countries between $4,000 and $12,000 per capita. However, if we make a much more granular analysis of the poverty lines of different countries, we can see that the poverty lines go up with the median income of countries. So even using these 190, 320, and 55 poverty lines for bunches of countries does not capture the full heterogeneity of poverty lines across countries over time. So the idea is indeed what was mentioned by academics, that the standards, the minimum standard of living varies with the economic development of a country. What is considered the minimum necessary for a dignified life changes with the standards of living of the country. That has led the bank to introduce a fourth poverty measure, which is what we call the societal poverty line, which is a function of the standards of living of a given country, and is defined by this equation that is either the maximum of $1.90, which is the low-income country's poverty line, or $1 plus 50% of the median consumption. That creates this, this blue line that I show in the graph that involves a poverty line that is strictly country-specific. It doesn't bunches countries of groups of countries. Every single country has its own poverty line. And two countries will have the same poverty line if they have exactly the same median consumption or median income. So in this regard, these are poverty lines that allow for international comparisons, even though they may be different across countries, because it guarantees that two countries with the same level of standards of living will have the same line, which may not happen in a case of official poverty lines. Some cases, countries with very similar standards of living may have different lines. So these three poverty lines, absolute poverty lines of 190, 320, and 550, allows us to compare groups of countries, and the societal poverty line allows us to compare all the world with the same standard in principle, because it's applying the same line to countries that are similar. Finally, there is also the understanding, the recognition that money is not enough, and that monetary measures may fail to capture important aspects of standards of living, particularly because there are elements in the well-being of a society that depend on non-marketable goods or services. And sometimes many of these goods or services, or a good share of these goods and services, are publicly provided or have not very clear prices, private prices. So that has led the bank to also incorporate a multidimensional poverty measure, which has been part of research for several years and multiple institutions, academic and also some official statistic offices producing multidimensional measures for their countries. These multidimensional measures take into consideration access to education, health, housing, safety, security. So they try to put together not only the command through income and consumption of access to goods and services, but also the access to these public services that are fundamental for well-being. Perhaps the most important initial effort in this regard is the one by United Nations Development Program with the Human Poverty Index in the late 1990s, based on the academic work of Sabine Al-Kire and James Foster and the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, and the initiatives of multidimensional measures and indicators by countries like Ireland and UK in the developed world, and also in other countries in Latin America, particularly like Mexico, Chile, and Colombia, who have incorporated multidimensional measures of poverty as their official measures of poverty. The bank is now incorporating a multidimensional poverty measure that takes into consideration measures of monetary poverty, education in terms of enrollment of children and basic education among adults, and access to basic infrastructure in terms of drinking water, sanitation, and access to electricity. Also, in 2018, the bank experimented with a few countries for even including some measures in this multidimensional measure of health and nutrition and security. Currently, the bank sticks with the three big dimensions multidimensional measure because in the efforts to make global comparisons, you need to have all the surveys that you collect have information about all these dimensions. And currently is not feasible. So the measures I'm going to show in the future of this presentation and the efforts that the bank has done so far concentrate on monetary poverty, education, and basic infrastructure. And we're working for in the future also take into consideration health, nutrition, and security. This multidimensional measure in the bank takes specific weights that can be changed, and different authors have argued about the different weights that these different dimensions should have in the total index. In our case, the monetary poverty represents 1/3 of the index, and the education and basic infrastructure represent another third, which each of the indexes within this component representing an equal share of the total. But as I say, these weights are a decision that is somehow arbitrary and can be changed according to different academic or policy-making decisions. Finally, another important measure that the bank is measuring on a regular basis is what we call shared prosperity, which is somehow connected to inequality, but it's not a measure of inequality. The bank, its second corporate goal is to promote shared prosperity, together with eradicating extreme poverty. And the shared prosperity is introduced to underline the importance of growth that favors the poorest members of the society. Growth alone will not do it. It has to be growth that favors the bottom of the society, the poorest members of the society, and in specific terms for the share prosperity index is the growth in consumption or income for the bottom 40% of the population. This index has an inequality dimension, though it's not a inequality indicator. It can be proven that share prosperity is the sum of the growth in the mean income plus growth in the share of total income among those in the bottom 40% of the population. This leads to an indicator that is also reported on a regular basis in publications by the bank now, that is called the share prosperity premium, which is the difference between the growth in consumption or income of the bottom 40 minus growth in consumption or income what we call the prosperity premium. And it is, I will show, associated to changes in inequality. Let me now talk about the evolution of all these indices in poverty and share prosperity and a little bit on inequality for the Eastern Europe and Central Asian countries. For the period over the last 3 decades, the country has been monitoring poverty since 1990. The poverty rates at the $1.9 a day have been below the 10% mark almost for the 3 decades for Eastern Europe and Central Asia countries. You can see in this figure, the light blue line corresponds to Europe and Central Asia, and it's been below the 10% for all years, with a peak in years 1998 and 1999, but declining since to very, very low levels, very close to the 0%. This is a clear evidence that countries in upper middle income countries, the $1.9 a day is perhaps not the relevant poverty line to assess standards of living and well-being. If we measure poverty rates using the $3.2 and $5.5 a day, we still a trend that is very similar. But now the numbers seem more significant for Eastern Europe and Central Asia. The poverty rates at the 3.2 also had a peak in 1999 and have been declining since to a rate very slightly below the 10% by 2018. The 5.5 line shows the similar trend with a very, very rapid deceleration between 1999 and 2009, with very little progress since. The poverty rates at 5.5, which is perhaps the absolute poverty rate that is applicable to this group of countries, has been quite stable over the last decade. If we take into consideration a societal poverty line, the 3-decade period trends is very similar to the other lines. The poverty rates increased for the region between 1990 until 1999 and have declined since, with a very rapid pace between 1999 and 2009 and very slowly since. It is interesting to notice that for the region, the societal poverty rates are very similar, close to the 20% mark, to the rich countries, i.e. the rest of the world in the figure, the line in orange. Finally, the multidimensional poverty rate is certainly very low for Eastern Europe and Central Asia countries. Most of the indicators, both monetary, educational, enrollment, and educational attainment, as well as access to electricity, are among the lowest in the world, indicating the higher standards of living of the region, and only slightly higher to rich countries. The difference for the regions still in terms of access to some infrastructure, in terms of sanitation and access to drinking water, where the rates for this group of countries, even though the lowest among most of the countries in the world, are still above the rich countries. And this is particularly due to needs for additional infrastructure in Central Asian countries. Regarding share prosperity, and forgive me for this figure where the numbers are very small, this is a combination of 91 countries for which we have 2 surveys. This share prosperity indicator, being an indicator of growth, requires at least 2 surveys. We at the bank always work with access to microdata from surveys. And in the case of share prosperity, we need 2 surveys. And 2 surveys that are more or less in close years across a group of countries. So in this case, we use 91 countries for which we have a survey around 2012 and 2017. And this is the list of 91 countries. And within the square red, the red square, you can see the share prosperity numbers for the countries in Eastern Europe and Central Asia for which we have these 2 surveys. And you can see that most countries in the regions have positive share prosperity and indicators that are quite large, in many cases larger than in many other countries of the world. So for the period 2012-2017, the region has experienced positive share prosperity in most cases. Very few countries had negative share prosperity for that period. And it is interesting because this indicates that in most cases, growth for the region has favored those at the bottom 40% of the population. So it has been inclusive growth. And in some cases, this inclusive growth has been faster than for the rest of the population. One of the most exceptional cases is the case of Montenegro. One reason why we focus on the 40% is that the bottom 40% usually has a very small share of the total income or total consumption of a country. Ricardo Palma, an academic, has noticed that the share of the bottom 40% and the top 10% is what moves across countries, is what varies across countries. The share corresponding to the middle 50% of the population, those between the 5th and the 9th decile of the distribution, tend to hold an approximately equal share of total income across countries. And this is what this graph shows. Notice the blue bars. They are remarkably stable across these 91 countries. But the share of the bottom 40, which is the red and yellow bars, and the share of the top 10, which is the black bar, varies a lot from one country to another. This is what is called the Palma index, which is the ratio between the shares of the top 10 and the bottom 40%. And is the point that you can see to the right side of the figure, with the ratios going well above 1 or even well above 3 for the more unequal countries in the world, and around 1 or a little less for those countries in which the bottom 40% controls a larger share of total distribution. Countries in the Eastern Europe and Central Asia region are seen almost across all the distribution, with some countries in the middle, like Turkey and Russia, but also some countries at the bottom, like Poland and Moldova, with very low PALMA indexes and a larger share of the bottom 40% of the distribution. Why is so important share prosperity and the share prosperity premium? Well, for the 91 countries for which we have data, we can show that countries with positive share prosperity have seen larger increases, larger declines in poverty, which is the bottom yellow area. And the same happens with the share prosperity premium. That is, countries in which the bottom 40% have grown faster than the rest of the population have improved the position in total society. And therefore, the Gini coefficient has declined. So inequality has declined. So you can see this negative slope between poverty and share prosperity, and changes in poverty and share prosperity, and changes in Gini and share prosperity premium. That's why promoting inclusive growth, concentrating the economic growth among those in the bottom of the population, leads to reductions in poverty and reductions in inequality. Inclusive growth is a fundamental tool for poverty reduction and inequality reduction. Let me move towards the end of my presentation with a review of the impact of the pandemic on poverty. The impact is it's perhaps the largest we've seen in 3 decades. This is the changes in poverty in global numbers since 1992. And you can see at the extreme right of the figure that we see an increase in poverty never seen before. The estimates are for around 120 million people falling into poverty in year 2020, a number not seen before. Our estimates have been changing over time, and of course vary with the poverty lines. Our most recent estimate for the 190 varies between 119 and 124 million people entering poverty in year 2020. And this is using the most recent estimates of economic growth. Under the 320 poverty line, our estimates are between 228 and 236 million people. And for the 4.5 line, it's around 200 and 210 million people. You can see that in all cases, it is South Asia what represents the largest number of people entering poverty, which is represented by this orange bar, followed by Sub-Saharan Africa in the purple bars, and East Asia and the Pacific, represented by the blue bars. In any case, under the 3 lines, still the contribution of Eastern European and Central Asian countries to the global new poor is very small. However, it is still important for the region. Under the $190 a day, you can see that the very rapid decline of the number of poor that were expected to be 4.3 million in year 2021 Now they're expected to be 5.3 million. So it's an increase in 1 million people in very, very low levels of poverty. Using the 3.2 and the 5.5 lines, by 2021, the region is expected to have 3.4 or 7.2 million, additional million people in poverty by 2021. And this is basically the impact of the economic crisis due to the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. In terms of poverty rates, this means that for the 5.5 poverty line, the region should be is projected. These are all projections and estimates to a 1.4 percentage points poverty line higher than it would have been the poverty rate had the pandemic not occurred. In terms of country by country, agglomerate global numbers and regional numbers. But the poverty rates country by country are of a special interest to the policymakers. And this takes some time to produce because surveys have to be collected in order to have full information about income and consumption of the households. So working with our colleagues in the macro teams, we do projections of poverty rates twice a year, every year, for every single country, in what we call the macro and poverty outlooks. And these are projections that take into consideration growth projections, and no changes in inequality, and strong assumptions about how households benefit from economic growth or recessions. Based on these stringent assumptions, we have preliminary estimates of where the poverty rates may be heading to. And in almost every country of the region, we are projected to see an increase in poverty rates in the year 2020, which will not reach pre-pandemic rates until 2022 or even 2023. So all countries in the region have suffered because of the pandemic. We'll see increases in poverty rates at the 5.5 line, but it's expected that this situation will improve in 2021 and will reach levels before the pandemic, perhaps by 2022 or 2023, depending on the speed of their regrowth and compensatory policies. Let me conclude then with the very general considerations of the Poverty and Shared Prosperity Report 2020, which took into consideration the pandemic, but also the impact that armed conflict and climate change is having on the goal of eradicating poverty by 2030, which is one of the Sustainable Development Goals. As I indicated, this shock in 2020 and 2021 has created the largest increase in poverty over the last 30 years. Our estimates also indicate that for 2020 and 2021, shared prosperity growth will be lower than in the past period, the 2012-2018, that for which we have comparable data. So both indicators move towards a period, at least in the very short term, with higher poverty and higher inequality and less shared prosperity. Regarding climate, which is a slow-moving problem, we also included in our report some indicators of the dispersion at the geographical level of flood risks, which is only one of the potential impacts of climate change. And we can see that in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, there are areas in which the risk of catastrophic floods is quite high. and can put at risk a large share of the population. Our report also includes estimates of perhaps 61 to 132 million people falling into extreme poverty by the end of the decade by the complex impacts of climate change. And these are not only catastrophic floods, but it may also see the fall of agricultural revenues, labor productivity, food prices, disasters, health crisis. So these estimates also underline the importance of climate change as a driver of poverty. It is estimated that 1.4 billion people will be affected by climate change related phenomena. And half of these are people living below the 5.5 poverty line. So it is a combination of factors that those living in poverty, in addition to the conditions of deprivations due to poverty, will be also facing the shocks of climate change. And I'm not mentioning the issues of conflict, armed conflict, because they are not so important in the region. But there are regions that are very seriously affected by armed conflict. Sub-Saharan Africa and Middle Eastern and North Africa are regions particularly affected by conflict. Actually, the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa region, is one of the few regions that have seen increases in the poverty rate for several years now, since 2014, 2015. And this is basically due to armed conflicts and other forms of conflict that make poverty reduction extremely difficult. So these three factors, what we call the three C's, the COVID pandemic, climate change, and conflict, involve that the goal of ending extreme poverty in 2030 could be beyond reach in absence of swift, significant, and sustained action. So a very important effort in development policy needs to be adopted in order to eradicate poverty by 2030, I'm sorry. And this has allowed us to also identify what we call hotspots, because there are areas in which there is a combination of high poverty rates, high exposure to climate change effects, and conflict. So it is important to redouble efforts to take into consideration how all these factors may be creating increases in poverty or making it extremely difficult to reduce poverty. So we conclude the report with a series of very general recommendations, particularly because the COVID pandemic has made clear that this very complex phenomenon require a special attention. And something that seemed in many occasions as obvious is not necessarily put in place, which is implementing and designing policies that are effective in the ground and effective in the field. And in many cases, we have plans that do not work well in the field. This requires a second element, which is a lot of communication and make use of the best possible data. So you learn from stakeholders and take into consideration the knowledge of scientists, social groups, firms, and policymakers. So everybody has the best data possible to make possible that there is no difference between the design of policies and their implementation in the field. This takes into consideration a third pillar, which is the need for investing a lot in preparedness and prevention. This is something that is not usually high in the rank of politicians and policymakers, because investing in preparedness and prevention is not solving out something, it's preventing something. And it is now clear, because of what's been happening with the pandemic and what may happen with climate change in the future, is that it's much more important and much more economical to invest in preparedness and prevention than in fixing problems when they occur. And of course, because of the complexity of these problems that that involve many countries or many regions within a country, that cooperation and coordination is fundamental. The facts of climate change, pandemics, or armed conflicts are not subject to a single area. They usually have ripple effects that affect other areas and other constituent groups and other stakeholders. And that's why cooperation and coordination is a fundamental development policy. So you can visit all the data I've shared with you today. This is all publicly available data. The bank is committed to open data. These are the links, and I invite you to play and see all the numbers that we have been producing in all these indicators. So let me conclude giving you a big thank you. And again, thank you for the invitation to this important conference that I've been following for several years now. Spasibo. Spasibo.
Спасибо. Спасибо, Сэмюэль. Было очень интересно. И вы подтвердили ту мысль, что бедность очень сложно измерять. Очень сложно измерять. И в нашем мире, наверное, это сделать еще сложнее, чем в прошлом. Потому что слишком много факторов стало влиять на это. Да и плюс ко всему, видимо, потому что страны очень разные. И вроде бы бедность имеет, наверное, какие-то общие черты, но есть и национальные особенности. Значит, друзья мои, я не вижу вопросов, поэтому я повторяюсь, что вы можете поднять руку, да, вот несколько вопросов мы сейчас готовы попросить Сэмюэля на них ответить. И, Ольга Викторовна, что там у нас с YouTube? Тогда пока
я сейчас
думают,
смотрю,
коллеги,
я
если
думаю,
позволите,
что
я задам вопрос. Ольга,
Да.
вас не слышно. Ну, я понял,
Не
да,
слышно?
движение головы. Если позволите, я задам вопрос, пока другие коллеги думают. Сэмюэль, скажите, пожалуйста, вы говорили о данных. Вот что за данные вы используете для измерения бедности? Это микроданные, обследование доходов там, или расходов домашних хозяйств? Насколько они гармонизированы между собой? Потому что я смотрел доклад Всемирного банка, там была упомянута база ЛИС, это Luxembourg Income Study, но я знаю, там в этой базе данных не все страны мира, а вы работаете с таким огромным массивом. Это первый вопрос. Можно я задам сразу второй вопрос? Или не надо? А второй вопрос, правильно ли я понял, когда вы оцениваете сами границы, пороги бедности, то вы использовали результаты программы, глобальной программы сопоставлений и расчета паритета покупательной способности за 2011 год. То есть вы не использовали вот последние результаты 2017 года. И сразу третий, и все. Вот то, что это не 17-й год, а 11-й, отставание 6 лет, это могло повлиять на некоторые оценки. По крайней мере, наверное, на тенденции нет, но это мое мнение, я не знаю ваше. А вот соотношение между странами. Спасибо большое.
I will proceed to answer the questions of Professor Surinov. Thank you very much. Very good questions indeed. The type of data we use is what we will call the global monitoring database. This is, as you say, for the Western European countries, is the Luxembourg Income Studies. But for all other countries in the world, we make use of the household survey produced by the Statistical Office of the country. The bank has a series of agreements with most countries in the world, and we share microdata. We receive this microdata on formal agreements with the statistic office of every country, and we process those microdata. You are absolutely right. We do some homogeneity to try to make the consumption aggregates or the income aggregates, this varies from one country to another, so that these are as comparable as possible. Of course, different countries collect information about different types of expenditures and different types of incomes. We try to make this as compatible as possible. And there is in PovCalNet, which is the main depository of these results, detailed explanation of the sources. So any researcher can go and see, okay, for this country, what is the survey they used? And what kind of aggregations they've produced. So indeed, we use microdata from official household surveys. In some cases, income surveys, in other cases, consumption surveys. Regarding your second question, you are absolutely right. We are using the 2011 purchasing power parity rates, which is the global comparison initiative advanced by the World Bank and several other institutions in the world, to have a common exchange rate that allows for differences in prices across different countries in the world. We adopted for this recent report the most recent revision of the 2011 index or PPP index. We have not used the 2017, which is the most recent PPP. You're right. This was a decision taken by managers at the bank because we felt that introducing the 2017 could create additional variations and rankings across countries vis-a-vis the previous report. So, and it has happened to us before. There was an update of the 2011 sometime in the 2018 report. And part of the communication efforts was to explain not only what was happening with poverty trends, but what was happening to the PPPs. So in this occasion, we decided not to do this. But I think that with time, more recent PPP rates will be incorporated. But for now, we decided, given the complexity of the COVID pandemic and that we had a lot of the PPP's update. Finally, regarding tendencies and projections, again, you are right. We have projections, we have data, microdata, up until 2017, 2018. If you visit our pages, you'll see that the statistic office in the bank and our data scientists have a series of formal protocols by which they say we need to have surveys within a period of time around the baseline we're going to use. So this is why we always say it's around or circa 2017, because in some cases we have surveys 2015 to 16. In some cases we have surveys 2019, quite recent. So we adopt all these and say we are around this year. However, for this report, we had special issues with the survey for India, which had some technical difficulties and was not made publicly available. And that created an issue for producing regional numbers for South Asia. And again, what I mentioned about the time lag of the surveys. Surveys take time. And sometimes they are available to the researchers with 1 year or 2 years. That's when our macro colleagues have to do the projections. And we have to rely on assumptions about changes in inequality, elasticity of growth to poverty. And this is where we move our numbers from 2018 to 2020, 2021, and further years. So yes, there is an issue here about how our estimates vary. Actually, one of my slides show that our numbers were changing after 3 months because of precisely the adjustments of macro growth. That's why we have decided to make these projections more often. So now we're producing these notes twice a year. So we have a closer monitoring of how standards of living are evolving. But it's indeed an issue, a technical issue of how to do these projections. And I will say more. In the occasion of the pandemic, we are entering in a very different world. So this is a recession like never before that has, for some researchers, important implications in inequality. And therefore, our usual assumptions about how growth translates into poverty and changes in inequality may have changed a lot. So these are preliminary estimates of the initial shocks. We'll continue monitoring because perhaps our methods we've tried to be consistent with methods over time, but these times are different. So let's see how it evolves. These are our more recent estimates, and we hope to be on the right track, but the science is sometimes limited, and these are very exceptional times.
Спасибо за очень подробный, обстоятельный ответ. Я вам благодарен. Вы ответили на мои вопросы. Вот в чате появился еще один вопрос. Не могу его не задать. Ирина Корчагина. Какие тенденции в развитии многомерных индексов бедности и процветания, в скобках, благосостояния, вы видите? Какие тенденции в развитии многомерных индексов бедности и процветания, благосостояния вы видите? Пожалуйста.
Very good question. We are not reporting trends of multidimensional this time. This is one of the most difficult endeavors in poverty measure that we are having now. We are collecting the largest number of data possible. We only have 2 years. 2018 was the first year in which we produced multidimensional numbers. And this is the second time. And with a 2-year period, is very little what can be seen, these particularly rates of access to public goods and infrastructure. So we are expecting to develop in the near future longer time spans of these multidimensional measures. But for now, we have only reported numbers for 2017 or around 2017. But your point is important. We need to start monitoring the evolution. I can say that we have just published an interactive website on our multidimensional measures. It allows the reader, the visitor, to play with different indicators, change the weights, and compare countries. And we expect that in the near future, we'll also include the evolution over time. Thank you.
Спасибо, спасибо. Ну, теперь давайте мы дадим слово Людмиле Неворожкиной, потому что время неумолимо истекает. А потом у нас, я надеюсь, останется немного времени еще задать вопросы и, может быть, высказаться относительно того, что мы услышали. Пожалуйста, Людмила Ивановна, прошу вас.
И еще есть вопрос из Ютуба, я тогда потом зачитаю. Видно презентацию?
Все видно, все видно.
Угу. Людмила Ивановна, не слышно звука.
I start again.
Okay, please. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to first to express my gratitude to Mr. Freihe-Roдригес for this very interesting presentation and answers on the questions. And the next slide, please. The report covers various aspects of poverty measurements. It presents a comprehensive overview of the methodological issues of choosing poverty measures. The report presents results across various regions and countries. Notably, the report evaluates the impact of global factors such as COVID-19, armed conflicts, and climate change on poverty. Today's presentation focused on the problem of poverty in Eastern Europe and the Central Asia region. This is especially relevant in the context of this conference. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. The report demonstrated clearly that poverty around the world can take many faces. A Russian proverb says, "Someone gets an empty soul, and for someone pearls are too small." And an important benefit of the report is that it gives a careful consideration of 5 poverty measures for all regions worldwide. This makes it possible to refine the poverty profile for different regions and develop region-specific strategy to combat poverty. Furthermore, the use of different poverty measures has also helped clarify the impact of COVID-19 on poverty in different regions. Next slide, please. The huge gap in poverty level and quality of life among the different regions has led to the formulation of 2 main policy goals: overcoming extreme poverty and achieving shared prosperity. On the slide 21, sorry, not 19, 21, which presented Freihe-Roдрiges, one could see that Russian Federation, relatively to other countries in the region, has very low level of shared prosperity and negative shared prosperity premium in the recent years. I guess this is the wake-up call to our policymakers. Next slide, please. An important aspect. Next slide. An important aspect of the report is the analysis of the ongoing COVID-19 crisis on poverty. The report answers the questions: who are the new poor, and what countries are particularly affected by the current crisis. The report demonstrated that the impact of COVID-19 on poverty in various countries and regions will depend on a combination of 2 factors. First, the magnitude of the economic crisis due to COVID, And second, the number of people with incomes just above the poverty line. According to the World Bank, when applying conservative regional poverty threshold, it's 1.9 US dollars a day, over 72 millions of the projected new poor will come from the middle income countries. They would constitute more than 4/5 of the total new poor. The estimates would be much higher if we apply a more realistic poverty threshold for lower middle income countries like 3.2 US dollars a day. The new poor are likely to concentrate in dense urban settings, leading to the further spread of the pandemic. Many of the new poor are likely to be engaged in informal sectors, informal work, or work in construction or manufacturing. These are sectors in which economic activity is most affected by lockdowns and other mobility restrictions and continued social distancing. World Bank simulation of profiles of the new poor show that the new poor are projected to be more likely to live in urban areas, live in dwelling with better access to infrastructure, and own slightly more basic assets than those who were poor in before COVID-19 crisis. The new poor who are aged 15 years and older are also more likely to be paid employees and work more in manufacturing, service, commerce sectors than the chronic poor. The new poor tends to be more educated than the chronic poor and significantly less educated than the non-poor. Across sectors, a much higher share of the new poor compared with the pre-COVID poor are in traditional services like wholesale and retail, transport and warehousing, accommodation and restaurant and other sectors. Knowledge of the composition of new poor is essential for policy. While the support of the existing poor can be provided through the existing social programs, a new poor are harder to reach because many of them come from the informal sector and are the seasonal migrants or refugees. The report makes clear the magnitude of the problem of new poor. What remains, in my personal view, unclear, and of course could only be investigated in the future, is the issue of how fast the new poor would leave poverty and how many of them would remain chronically poor. What are the institutional and individual factors that determine the resilience of individuals and household to poverty? Such knowledge would allow policymakers to formulate the long-term measures that would increase the resilience to poverty of the society as a whole. In conclusions, I would like to say again, thank you for the presentation and contribution to the national policy debate. As this conference session showed, identifying the group new poor and development social support measures for this group is among the most critical problems for the Russian Federation policy makers. Thank you. I'm finished.
Mm-hmm.
Last slide, please.
Спасибо, Людмила Ивановна. Действительно, вот этот вопрос, который вы поставили относительно устойчивости этого нового состояния для тех людей, кто оказался в бедности, исходя из вот новых реалиях, насколько это все устойчиво, и как это измерять, и выяснить факторы, почему кто-то смог вырваться, а кто-то остаться там. Да, действительно, это очень интересная штука, я абсолютно разделяю вашу мысль. Спасибо. У нас появились несколько вопросов к Сэмюэлю. Поэтому, Сэмюэль, я вас прошу, вы прочитайте вопросы на английском языке. Там, по-моему, 2 вопроса. Да? Наверное,
И есть
даже
еще
3 вопроса.
3 уже, да?
3 вопроса. Вы можете в чате посмотреть, чтобы мы время не теряли на перевод туда-сюда? От Елены Гориной в чате вопрос. Вы сами можете прочитать на английском языке? Он?
Я могу прочитать для эфира.
Вы можете?
Хорошо?
Ну, окей, давайте тогда.
Да.
Тогда давайте сделаем так, Ольга. Давайте так. Во-первых, я плохо слышу, потому что я что-то все выключил, чтобы эхо не было. А вот эхо появилось. Тогда читайте все 3 вопроса, попросим Сэмюэля ответить на них, с учетом времени.
Хорошо.
Пожалуйста.
Сейчас. Dear Samuel, we have some questions on YouTube chat. The first one is from Elena Gorina. She asks, does poverty growth in 2020-2021 depend on country COVID policy response, including lockdowns and other restrictions? And her second question is there such an evidence from your data? And the second question from Ksenia, you have already answered.
И там 3-й еще вопрос.
Давайте он тогда, может, ответит потом.
Ну, давайте.
Спасибо.
Very good. With regards to the first question from Elena Gorina, I should say that in some cases we have included these policy measures, and in others we haven't. That's why I was responding to Professor Surinov that our projections to 2020 and 2021 are based on our best knowledge on how to do these projections, using sometimes very different methodologies. These projections are done by our country economists who try to take into consideration both the projections and the estimates about economic growth, as well as the impact of compensatory policies and lockdowns adopted by different countries. So in this case, in contrast to the global studies, in which we try to use the same methodology for every single country, in the cases of these twice-a-year updates, it is something that is much more related to what's happening in the country. So I would say that in most cases, our country economists have tried to take into consideration both growth perspective and policy adopters. The question from Ksenia was that the correlation we make between the share prosperity premium and inequality, in which share prosperity drives a decline in inequality as measured by the Gini, could also be applied to other measures of inequality, like the Palma Index, or there are many other. I think it's a good question. We haven't tested that. I think it is likely that that most inequality in relation to the Shepherd period. But I think it's an interesting work to do. We haven't done it. We did it with the Gini, which is the most popular inequality index.
Thank you very much.
Спасибо большое.
Да, спасибо. Я сейчас видел, что на тот вопрос Карева уже Сэмюэль ответил. Ну да, действительно, связь между Палмой и Джинни должна быть, но какая? Пожалуйста, еще вопросы. Ольга, появились еще вопросы в YouTube?
Нет, пока нету больше вопросов.
Нет вопросов. Ну, коллеги, у нас, в общем-то, время подходит к завершению. Пожалуйста, может быть, кто-то из нашей аудитории хочет прокомментировать, не только задать вопрос. Пожалуйста, есть такая возможность.
Для этого нужно поднять руку, и мы сможем дать вам слово.
Что-что?
Для этого нужно будет поднять руку, и мы сможем дать вам слово.
Ну, я уже об этом говорил. Нужно поднять руку. Вот там на верхней панели есть рука, и вы можете это сделать. Ну, думайте. Давайте я тогда немножко два слова скажу, потому что как-то такой сложный, серьезный вопрос. В общем-то, измерение бедности всегда волнительно. Это вопрос, потому что, с одной стороны, это вопрос чисто научный, как это измерять, что это такое, как это измерять. А с другой стороны, конечно, он политический. И когда вмешивается политика, очень часто наука, ну, вынуждена бывает отойти в сторону. И это очень нехорошо. Но с другой стороны, наверное, то, что мы измеряем, оно делается для политики, с тем, чтобы эту ситуацию исправить. Поэтому, конечно, очень сложное измерение. И, вы знаете, в России у нас граница бедности считается то одним способом, то другим способом, то третьим способом. Ищут лучший способ. И, ну, не знаю, мне кажется, что такие оценки, с одной стороны, должны быть стабильны во времени, а с другой стороны, конечно, нельзя запретить искать лучшие метрики. Конечно, они должны быть, и это всегда люди находятся в поиске лучших инструментов. Мне кажется, это абсолютно нормально. Вот то, что нам сегодня рассказал Сэмюэль, это бесспорно важно и интересно. И такой подход, например, к измерению социальной черты бедности, да, он действительно, с одной стороны, метод, скажем так, сближает все страны, потому что мы применяем как бы один метод. При этом то, что это медиана, мы учитываем разницу между странами. Это вот в этом как бы такой, ну вот подход. Но надо, честно говоря, он непривычен, по крайней мере для меня. Надо, конечно, с ним пожить, посмотреть, посчитать, посмотреть, что из этого получается. Потому что я вспоминаю статью, по-моему, эта статья была в Германии, по-моему, в Германии, да, относительно вот того, когда Евросоюз провозгласил, что там они должны сократить огромное число, миллионы бедных там за 20 лет. И начались уже, когда наступил момент, как бы сказать, отчета перед обществом, что вот ну, как у нас сократилась бедность. Начались статьи, что вообще-то это и вот это вот, когда через медиану меряем 40% медианы, это не совсем и бедность, это скорее неравенство, да? Что мы вроде вот как-то не бедность измеряем, а измеряем неравенство. Начались такие разговоры. То есть я хочу сказать, что во всех странах мира ищут этот вот, ну, лучший инструмент. Сможет ли человечество его найти, это, конечно, вопрос. Но вот подход сам такой, который позволяет странам сопоставить между собой, очень важен. И для России, вы знаете, вот если посмотреть на Россию, у нас же страна очень большая. Ну, мы там 7-я, 8-я страна в мире по численности населения. И 1-я по территории. И можете представить, какие различия по территории, там климат, традиции, условия жизни. И вот когда мы приходим с одним мерилом ко всем нашим региональным популяциям, насколько это тоже имеет право на жизнь. Москва и Чукотка, да, там крайний север, там и юг, там и какие-то там отдаленные территории или высокоурбанизированные территории. Вот все, что делается вот с точки зрения таких вот международных кросс-страновых исследований я всегда пытаюсь примерить, а можно это применить в России, вот именно с позиции вот учета региональных особенностей. Потому что насколько мы можем прийти с одной корзинкой к людям, которые живут на севере, у них и диета другая должна быть, и одежда, и затрат на тепло, или к людям, которые живут на юге. Поэтому вот это, конечно, очень сложная, очень сложная штука. Но я смотрю, ничего у нас не появилось у меня, по крайней мере. Ольга мне сигналит, что тоже у нее не появилось. Ну, давайте тогда мы поблагодарим нашего докладчика и содокладчика поблагодарим. Замечательные выступления, замечательные доклады. Они позволяют нам понять одно, что мы мало чего знаем, и что мы должны засучить рукава и продолжать наши исследования. Это первое. Второе, то, что мы не одни. С нами Всемирный банк, это очень хорошо, с нами большой отряд исследователей из разных стран, это, в общем-то, прекрасно. И, наверное, у нас есть хорошие шансы, возможности, в общем-то, на самом деле добиться хороших инструментов, и вооружить нашими расчетами, нашими оценками тех, кто разрабатывает политику, с тем, чтобы, конечно, политика была такой, чтобы мы смогли выполнить цели устойчивого развития с точки зрения ликвидации нищеты, по крайней мере, ее в крайних проявлениях, и сокращения значительной степени неравенства как между странами, так и внутри стран. Спасибо вам большое, спасибо всем за участие. Я еще раз говорю, очень благодарен и организаторам со стороны Высшей школы экономики, и со стороны Международной ассоциации измерения благосостояния и доходов, за то, что мы все вместе смогли встретиться и провести такой замечательный круглый стол. Спасибо вам большое. И, конечно, большие добрые слова непосредственным организациям, Ольге Викторовне и нашим переводчикам, которым сегодня, я думаю, досталось. Терминология была не очень простая. Спасибо вам огромное. Вы, в общем-то, выполнили главную задачу. Вопрос общения людей, которые говорят на разных языках. Спасибо огромное. Всем всего самого доброго. Не болейте. И дай Бог, чтобы ковид минул нас.
Сэмюэль, thank you very much. Сэмюэль, thank you.
Всего доброго.
Very much for the invitation. A pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much.
Tanzania.